Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here and to give a talk. I'm honoured to be in front of such knowledgeable, expert people on imagery. I still don't feel quite as at home in the imagery world as I do in the perception world. So I'm really hoping that your feedback will help make my thoughts on this kind of topic better than they are. Okay, so the claims that I want to make in this paper are that visual perceptual experience and visual imagery are not categorically different. Because, first of all, there are many such states that exhibit some features of one and some features of the other, and there's disagreement on how to classify these kinds of cases. And the disagreement on classification, I think, is really sort of quite, when you come to see what's going on in these cases, it's kind of completely arbitrary which way we should jump in terms of classification. So we just shouldn't do that sort of thing. We should just appreciate the kind of non-categorical nature of perception and imagination. And I hope that en route we'll see that spelling out the different features of perceptual imagery and perceptual experience is difficult and complex. So this paper really started life as a paper that I was delivering at conferences for people who have aphantasia, that is, they lack visual imagery. And whilst people who have imagery always sort of ooh and ah about, oh, I wonder what it would be like not to have visual imagery, it seemed to me that the people with aphantasia were all ooh and ahhing about what it would be like to have imagery. And my thought was, well, suppose we were to try and sort of, get across exactly what it's like, what would we have to say? So some of this paper I'll talk about explaining, the nature of imagery, and that's not just thinking about ourselves as philosophers and ourselves getting clear on that, which is very important, but also thinking about how we can sort of explain this and provide interesting examples to people who lack imagery. Okay. So the position that I'm arguing for here isn't a novel one, but I think that at least some of the considerations and arguments that I'm putting forward in favour of it are. A recent explicit advocate of this view is Nigel Thomas. He also cites Joseph Jastrow and C. Wade Savage as those who have argued for it explicitly. No doubt there are others. If there are sort of obvious people I'm missing, please don't hesitate to tell me. So Thomas says that many people hold this view sort of implicitly, and no doubt that's true. But if we look at the recent literature, we can see a lot of people do not hold this view. They kind of really want to, for every sort of case, or for many cases, they want to really stipulate that it's perception, perceptual experience, or it's imagery experience. And they're very much into this categorization project. And I think that we particularly, but not only, see this tendency amongst a lot of modern scientists. Okay, so the focus of this talk is on the nature of conscious experiences had during perception and imagery. So I'm just going to set aside the following questions: whether there's unconscious imagery or unconscious perception, whether hallucination is the same type of experience as that had in perception. When I talk about perceptual experience in this talk, unless I explicitly say otherwise, take me to be talking to the good case of veridical perception of the world. So first of all, I want to give you a rough outline of what I think the categorical view and the continuum views are of the difference between perceptual experience and imagery experience. And then I'm going to sort of present to you a selection of cases, by no means all the sorts of cases I think that make this point, some of which are ones particular to me, some of which I think other people have made, but these are just a selection of cases, interesting ones that I'm thinking about at the moment. Okay, so on the categorical view, we sort of have this kind of sharp distinction where we place on one side cases of perceptual experience and the other side cases of imagery. And the sort of features that we're told perception has is perception is vivid, the content of perception is determinate, perceptual experience gives us a sense of reality, that the objects that we are aware of really exist in the world in front of us. It tends not to be voluntary vis-a-vis the onset of experience or what the content of the experience is. And this voluntariness criterion could be both a sort of non-phenomenal criterion, like is it really voluntary or not, or it could be a phenomenal criterion, like do you feel a sense of this is voluntary to you? I'm not really going to be talking about the voluntary case very much, although there's lots to be said about it. And then there's this question about, is the state determined by the way the world is? And I take it that that's a non-phenomenological criterion. And on the categorical view, people think that perceptual experience is all up on this side of the graph, and imagery is not vivid, it's not determinate, it's not present, it's not voluntary, etc., etc. And these are, you know, for every experience, we can place it into one or other category. And on some views, it's on accordance with all of these sort of different dimensions. But on other views, they just pick one of these dimensions and they say that's the one. So, for example, it looks like someone like Mohan Matin, as we'll be looking at later in the talk, seems to think like if it's the world that's determining the way the state is, then that's just perceptual experience. And what else is going on vis-a-vis the state doesn't matter. Whereas in other cases, we'll see other people picking different ones of these criteria and saying that's the one that matters, that tells you whether this is a perceptual experience or an imagery experience. And in opposition to this, the view that I like, what's called the Continuum View, says that okay, like maybe it's a gross generalization that typically, maybe even not typically, but like maybe best to say would be paradigmatically, perhaps perceptual cases tend to be more vivid, determinate, have the sense of reality, aren't voluntary, determined by the way the world is, and imagery experience is not like that. But actually, there's a whole range of cases in the middle, and there's no way of placing any case clearly on the perception side and the imagery side. We should just accept that there's a kind of continuum of positions that various states will fall under, and it's going to be completely arbitrary whether you decide in one case, oh yeah, that's perception or that's imagery. So just get rid of that forced choice categorization and just recognize this beautiful, lovely spectrum. That's the view. Okay, so I want to start by talking about this vividness criterion. So David Hume famously said that the difference between visual imagery and visual experience is that imagery is less vivid and lively. And these words have echoed down the ages, and almost everyone sort of spouts that. The first line they talk about imagery is they quote Hume. A lot of philosophers do this today, and a lot of scientists do this today. And a lot of scientific studies are based on asking people about the vividness of their visual imagery. And so clearly, to many people, these words strike a chord and point towards a phenomenological and important phenomenological difference between typical visual experience and visual imagery. However, to the extent that it is true that visual imagery is less vivid and lively, that's clearly not a generalization without exceptions. So people with what's called hyperphantasia report in the VVIQ, the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, that their imaginative experience is every bit as, quote, vivid as perceptual experience. And very nice recent work, a nice exemplar, but not the only one of this, is by Milton et al. They report that we now have independent behavioral and neural measures of differences between people who come out on the VVIQ as having this very vivid experience compared to other subjects. So it looks like we're not merely relying on self-report to identify that there really are people with this vivid imagery. So in this case, it looks like imagery on the right-hand side here. Can you guys see if I move my pointer a bit like this? Can you see that? Yes, thank you. So the thought is that hyperphantasics with imagery, their imagery isn't not vivid. Their imagery is right up here. In fact, they say it's every bit as vivid as perception. Well, if that's right, it looks like vividness is no good way to distinguish perceptual experience and imagery experience. And likewise, to the extent that it's generally true that perceptual experience is vivid, there's clearly a range of more and less vivid perceptual experiences. So experiences of bright carnivals and so on seem more vivid and lively than experiences of council estates, and those indeed seem less vivid than experiences of a misty Scottish loch. So on these cases, it seems like we have perception cases of perceptual experience, and to various degrees, we can think that they too can slide up this way towards what we would think of as the non-vividness of imagery. Okay, so because of these cases of imagery and perceptual experience, we can't use, I don't think, vividness as a defining characteristic that lets us identify and distinguish perceptual experience from imagery experience. But I think that's a point that lots of people would recognize, quite familiar. I don't think I'm saying anything hugely novel there. But I think worse than this, there's reason to think that it is just not literally true that perceptual experience is more vivid and lively than imagery, even when that claim is made as a gross generalization. So I think even figuring out what these terms are supposed to mean is actually far more difficult than is standardly acknowledged. So consider lively. Experience is not literally lively, it's not alive, it's not jumping around or doing anything like that. The use of that word is clearly metaphorical in some sense. And it's not really very clear to me at all how you can say non-metaphorically what is meant by that. And likewise, consider vivid. So clearly the content of an experience can be more or less vivid in a straightforward use of the term. The content of your carnival experience is more vivid, is more colourful and bright than your experience of the misty Scottish loch. And of course, you can straightforwardly extend the use of this term. So you can speak of the experience of the carnival as being more vivid in virtue of the more vivid content than the imagery experience, than the perceptual experience of the misty loch, which the content is less vivid. Straightforward, so far, so good. So you might think then that just as image 6 is more vivid than image 3, so too we might say that your visual experience of 6 is more vivid than your experience of image 3. I can also imagine each of these images. I can imagine image 6, I can imagine image 3, and it seems to me perfectly reasonable to say that my imagery, when I'm imagining image 6, is more vivid than my imagery than when I'm imagining image 3. Again, very straightforward. We're taking the content of the experience, saying one's more, in terms of content, more vivid than the other, so the corresponding experiences with that content are more vivid than the other. So far, so unproblematic. But the claim that we are sort of being asked to consider is that imagery is less vivid than perceptual experience. And the question then is, well, how is that claim supposed to be made true? So is the idea supposed to be that when I visually imagine image 6, the imagery experience I have is equivalent to the perceptual experience I have when I see image 3? Well, this is certainly the idea that a huge amount of imagery research endorses. So that picture of the various horses is used as an exemplar in research to ask people, how vivid is your imagery of a horse? Is it like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? But so these sorts of diagrams, you also get, there's another kind of example where you get these kind of different vividness of apple pictures, and you're saying, imagine an apple, pick which of these represents the vividness of your imagery. So people are being asked to rate imagery, often on just a scale alone, but often against their visual experience of these images. But the idea that when I visually imagine image 6, the imagery experience I have is equivalent to that I had when I see image 3, I think is just utterly and completely misguided. When I imagine 6, my imagery is simply not like seeing 3. Seeing 3 is like seeing a horse in the dark, but what I'm imagining is not a horse in the dark, I'm imagining a horse in bright sunlight. So I'm simply not imagining a horse in the dark, which is what it is like to see 3. And I think that the point can be brought home further. So if imagining 6 is like seeing 3, I take it imagining 5 should be like seeing 2, imagining 4 should be like seeing 1. But an imagery experience of 1 doesn't seem to represent a horse at all. It seems to represent a black square. And if I imagine 1, what's my experience supposed to be like? Is it supposed to be seeing something less black? Is it supposed to be like seeing something gray or white? And why would that be the case? Why would that amount to imagining black? I think this just shows us that this kind of model is utterly implausible. So why would people generally agree? I mean, I feel the pull myself that, yeah, it's kind of right to say that imagery is less vivid than perceptual experience. Vivid doesn't mean vivid in the ordinary literal sense of bright and deep color. If you look at the dictionary, there's slight variations in how it's specified, but that's what's given. And in the way that's depicted in allegedly illustrative diagrams, which suck out the bright and deep color from various images and ask you to compare and contrast. Moreover, if you look to dictionaries for help, as far as I can see, there is none. We're always given a meaning to do with bright colours and maybe a lack of blurriness. And then we're told that this can apply to imagery, but of course, nothing more illuminating is said. So we're stuck with, I think, not really understanding what it is for perceptual experience to be more lively and vivid than imagery, other than some kind of, I don't know, it just kind of seems like the right sort of thing to say. And therefore, if you wanted to try and explain to people who've never experienced imagery what it's like to have, showing these pictures of, increasingly horses and increasingly dusky light is really not getting there at all. Sort of as I sort of noted right at the start, not only do we not really have a good grip on what imagery, on what vividness is when it comes to imagery and perceptual experience, we can't use vividness as a defining characteristic that lets us identify and distinguish perceptual experience from imagery experience. So I want to go on now and examine the other phenomenological criteria to see whether they help us distinguish perceptual experience from imagery and to understand what it's like to have it. And I'll leave it to the audience to determine whether you think these other phenomenal differences capture the intuitive sense of vividness that I think we all sort of feel a draw to saying that people readily sign up to. I don't have a view on this myself, and if you have a view, I'd love to know what you think. Okay, so numerous people have said that imagery is less determinate than perceptual experience. Being less determinate amounts to representing things less specifically. So we can distinguish between a determinable property and its determinations. That's the properties which determine that it exists, it holds, it is true, it's present. The property of square, for example, determines the property of being shaped. The property of being crimson and the property of being scarlet each determine the property of being red. If you're a metaphysician, you may have very interesting things about what determination is and how we should spell this out and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into that. Typically, when I see a horse, I experience a lot of detail. In this case, I see the precise colour of its coat in light and shadow. I see the location of all the bits of the hair and the mane, the exact position of the legs and so on. And certainly I take myself to have fairly standard normal imagery. That's how I come out when I do these imagery questionnaires. When I imagine a horse, I would say the imagery often seems to represent less. I think that's right. Exactly where the shadows fall, particularly, that never really seems to be there. What the precise colour is, where each wisp of hair is, doesn't really seem to often be represented in the image. Although, of course, if I turn my attention to these, maybe I can sort of do a lot of work to try and fill in a lot of that. But in general, it seems kind of right. And indeed, Daniel Dennett claims, for example, that you can visually imagine an object without imagining it to be any colour at all. So you can imagine a cow, various of its features, but there needn't be any particular colour that you've imagined this cow to be. So completely indeterminate as to what colour the cow is. And so all this, I think, reflects at least some of my own imagery experience. So I would agree that imagery is at least typically less determinate than perceptual experience. But first of all, we should note that there are cases of not very determinate perceptual experience. The sort of foggy, misty scenes of a loch would be one we've already discussed. Another nice example is seeing a near object out of focus because you're focusing on things far beyond. That's quite a nice other example. And indeed, elsewhere, I've argued that in the way that Dennett thinks there can be visual imagery that doesn't involve representation of colour, I think there can be visual experiences, perceptual experiences, that don't represent colour at all. So I actually think perception can be very indeterminate in the very way that Dennett thinks imagery can be. Note also that there are cases of quite determinate imagery. So for example, that had during focused imagery exercises where you sort of sit down and close your eyes, you relax and you take your time and someone talks you through quite often a scene and so on. I've done that kind of thing, and I certainly would say that my imagery was certainly more vivid than it certainly typically is. We've already spoken about hyperphantasia and people saying it's more vivid. Based on my own personal discussion of people with hyperphantasia, they would say it's more determinate. It's determinate, they would say, just like perception is. However, I don't actually know of scientific evidence that backs up this point, because the only evidence ever seems to be about vividness. No one seems to pick apart these different phenomenological dimensions and ask people about determinateness. And so I think there's a lot of interesting work to do on that. But you know, it wouldn't surprise me, and to the best of my knowledge, people with hyperphantasia would say that their imagery is determinate. Another case is the case of flashbacks had by people who have post-traumatic disorders of various kinds. On the assumption that their flashbacks are imagery, of course, there is some dispute about whether flashbacks are imagery or hallucination and so on. Some researchers take them to be imagery, some researchers take them to be hallucination. I myself think that this is one of those cases where we can't really categorize, and et cetera, et cetera. But for those people who thought they were imagery, then these would clearly be cases where the imagery is more determinate. They seem very detailed and so on in reports. So while as a gross generalization, it seems true to say that determinateness differentiates perceptual experience and imagery, it can't really be a defining criterion that lets us identify which is which, because there's lots of cases that just are exceptions to that gross generalization. So now I want to explore another phenomenological difference between perceptual experience and imagery experience, that's the sense of reality. So first of all, I want to make a small distinction here. So a lot of people talk about the sense of reality, and some people talk about the sense of phenomenal presence or the sense of presence. Dockich and Martin make quite a nice distinction here. They think that in a way there's two senses of phenomenal presence. One is like the sense of reality, the sense that an object is real, and another is something like the sense of directness or indirectness or mediatedness or unmediatedness that you have to an object. Like for example, if you're in VR, you might feel that you don't really have immediate access to objects, or watching them on TV, you might not feel you have this immediate or direct acquaintance with things. In standard perception, you would. I just want to set aside that sort of immediate kind of case. I really want to focus in on the sense of reality. Dockich and Martin think these are both forms of perceptual presence. Some people just talk of the sense of reality as being perceptual presence. Just want to focus in on that, yes, the sense of reality I'm after here. So Dockich and Martin say that the sense of reality is the sense that a perceptual object is real, i.e. belongs to the actual world, rather than a merely possible or even impossible world. And as I've just said, I'll focus in on this being the relevant notion. So the idea is that perceptual experience presents objects and properties as existing here and now in the actual world. And it's often said that imagery presents us with a way that the world could be. It tells us not how things are, but how things might be. And there's an interesting debate about how the sense of presence manifests itself in our experience. So some people claim it's part of the content of experience. So your perceptual experience is something like it's a propositional attitude, like in that it's got this attitudinal bit which says something like, it is the case that, it is true that, and then the content is something like there's an apple in front of you. But the idea here is that if you build the reality into the content, you take it that your perceptual experience says something like, it is true that, and then the content is there's a real apple in front of you. An alternative view, the attitudinal view, says the attitude actually builds in that reality component. So you say the attitude is something like, in actuality, it's true that, or it's really true that, or you build that reality part into the attitude, and then the content is there's an apple in front of me, something like that. And then other people, including Dockich and Martin, think that this the sense of reality is a metacognitive feeling. So it's a feeling that often accompanies perceptual experience, but it's distinctive from it. So again, while it might be true as part of some gross generalization that perceptual experience presents objects of the sense of reality and imagery does not, there are very notable exceptions, and detailed explication of this criterion, I think, is lacking in the literature. Dockich and Martin are nice at doing some subtle distinctions here, but I just think there's so much more that needs to be said about this. So to start with the exception cases, so this is a case that Dockich and Martin talk about at length in their work. Some people suffer from derealization disorder. Dockich and Martin cite Jaspers as noting that the sense of reality tends to be taken for granted until it's disturbed pathologically, and so we appreciate that it really exists. It really exists. I shouldn't have said really there, too many reallys now. So derealization has many causes and occurs both in the clinical population and the non-clinical population. Common to all these forms is the experience that the world doesn't seem real or actual to people anymore. And this is typically reported as a case where perceptual experience lacks a sense of reality. This is really the sort of, paradigm example of that. However, there's an objection from Mohan Matin. I'm told that Husserl also thinks this. I know nothing about Husserl, just noting that. We're just going to stick with Mohan's view here. So Mohan Matin argues that in normal visual perception, the scene is not simply imagined, but seems to present the perceiver's own surroundings as so. I will refer to this as a sense of presence. And he goes further and says that the sense of presence is essential to or constitutive of perceptual experience. And this is because he thinks that it's part of the attitudinal nature of perceptual experience. He thinks that perceptual experience says it is real that, an apple is present. So every time you have a perceptual experience, you have that attitudinal component that says it is real that. So it's essential to an experience being perceptual that it has this sense of presence built into the attitude element. So man must think that derealization does not involve having perceptual experience because it lacks this sense of reality. We might speculate that he would think it involves imagery experience, but imagery that's driven by external stimuli. It would be a plausible view for him to hold. Now, in opposition to this, Dockich and Martin claim that the sense of presence is a metacognitive feeling that typically accompanies perceptual experience, but it needn't. So you can have a perceptual experience that doesn't have this sense of reality. So they claim it's just not essential to perceptual experience. And they go on to provide additional reasons to think that those with derealized disorder are indeed perceiving and having a perceptual experience. So they say, derealized patients have intact perceptual competences. They do not seem to have any problems pertaining to the identification or recognition of the perceived objects. Their ventral systems are functioning well, and their sensory motor abilities are apparently impeccable. Their dorsal systems are also functioning well. They do not have any known perceptual deficits, such as agnosia or ataxia. It's empirically plausible that they have genuine perceptual experiences of the world. Okay. So what should we make of this debate between Mann, who says no sense of presence, not perception? Dockich and Martin are going, well, there's no sense of reality, but of course it's perception. Look at all these facts that tell us perception's going on. Well, clearly any sensible person shouldn't dispute the empirical facts that Dockich and Martin are citing about the deficits or lack of them in derealization, and no doubt Mathen wouldn't either, but I don't suppose that they would actually move him to change his position either. Dockich and Martin don't explicitly say it, but they seem to be suggesting that what determines the nature of the state that you're having, when that's the world, then that's sort of, that trumps, at least, maybe it's sufficient, maybe it's not, at least it trumps the lack of sense of presence in determining that here we have a perceptual experience. Mathen is suggesting the opposite. The lack of sense of presence at least trumps the fact that the world determines the state, and thus determines that perceptual experience is not being had in this situation. So how do we choose between these different ways of characterizing the experience? Well, it seems to me that each view seems unpalatably, arbitrarily stipulative. It's like, you know, why would you say, well, this one is the thing that wins, or this one is the thing that determines its perception rather than imagery? If, like me, you don't want to engage in that practice, then an easy alternative is to think that perceptual experience and imagery are not mental states that belong to distinct categories, but they simply differ in degree. That would allow us to recognize that derealized perceptual experiences have two features that pull in different directions as to the classification of the state, but we don't need to choose either of those directions. So we can just note this fact, not choose between them, and label the state as being at some intermediate point on the perception imagery scale. So a derealized perception would be up here on it's a state that seems to be determined by the world. It doesn't seem voluntary. Sense of reality, of course, is right down here where you would typically expect imagery to be, or at least as a gross generalization. It would seem to me it's determinate because there's no perceptual disorders and so on. I've stuck it in the middle here in the Vividness Criterion. Seems to me that's where I would sort of judge this to be, but who knows? Don't pay much attention, and there's nothing hugely significant there. I suspect that's where it is, but hey ho. So I think that the feeling of reality criterion is actually even more complex than has been discussed thus far. That becomes evident when we start to think about to what extent imagery experience itself has a sense of presence. So we've already spoken about hyperphantasia, very vivid imagery. One interesting feature of hyperphantasia is that people with that have a poor memory for what happened versus what was imagined. And if you thought that that was because their imagery had more of a sense of presence than standardly taken to be, that would explain that fact. Scientists often cite that fact to explain this. So perhaps it's likely that their imagery has more of a sense of reality than neurotypical imagery, but clearly more empirical work is needed on that, and will depend on precisely drawing out these different phenomenal strands of the nature of imagery experience. Hallucinations and dreams are other interesting cases, which we just see the same kind of debate going on. These are often termed imagery states by the scientific community, and they cite that's because they're not driven by an external stimulus. They're perception-like, not driven by external stimulus, so they're imagery, and they get classified as imagery largely by the scientific community. Yet philosophers typically classify these as perceptual experiences. A hallucination is a perceptual experience had not caused by the external environment and so on. And they're doing that, I think, on phenomenological grounds. It's got the phenomenology of perception, at least, you know, when philosophers are considering hallucinations, they're considering precisely phenomenologically matching hallucinations. It's just not the sort of state that's driven by external stimulation. So they tend to judge those are perceptual experiences. And again, I don't think we have to choose between these accounts. And I don't think that this is a kind of, I don't really think it's a real difference that, you know, one people are saying this is perceptual experience, the other people are saying this is imagery. You know, we just note the different features of these states, note that the features make them somewhat like imagery, make them somewhat like perceptual experience, and then just place them in between on the spectrum and be done with it. Another case for consideration is the case of amodal completion. So I love this picture on the right. So it looks to most people as if player number 13 has an incredibly long arm here, right? It's a visual joke. Of course, the end point of the arm here really belongs to player number 9, not player number 13, but the way it's all lined up, it looks as if this part of the arm belongs to this part of the arm. This is a huge long arm going behind player number 9. Okay, so there are lots of cases to talk about where we might think imagery affects our perceptual experience. I've discussed lots of cases like that myself. Benson Nami, amongst others, has claimed that in amodal completion, like this kind of case of the footballer's long arm, what's going on in here is that you're adding imagery to your perceptual experience to get this experience of the one long arm. So let me just say a little bit about what amodal completion is, distinguish it from modal completion. So amodal completion typically occurs when a part of an object is experienced as occluded, and yet is reported as experienced as having a particular shape and boundary. And it's unlike what's called modal completion, because the occluded amodally completed object's parts do not appear within our experience in virtue of a colour or lightness boundary. So to give you a really nice example of the difference, we can look at the Knizia triangle figure here. Most people say they experience a bright white triangle pointing upwards. Of course, there's not really such a triangle there. All there is on this bit of paper on the screen are black Pac-Man figures and then these 3 black angles here. But a lot of people say it looks to them as if there's this bright lighter white triangle pointing upwards. This is modal completion. The edges appear in your experience in virtue of an illusory but lightness boundary. This bit here looks brighter, lighter white than the background here. So that's modal completion. And amodal completion is that occurs when a lot of people say they experience a downward facing triangle pointing downwards. It seems to be occluded by the light bright triangle pointing upwards. And although this looks like a downward pointing triangle, you don't see the occluded portions of the side in virtue of a brightness boundary or something like that. There's just a sense of presence that they're there, but there's not in the way that there is this bright boundary that you experience along this edge. You don't experience anything along this edge, right? Precisely because it seems hidden by the triangle here. So that's amodal. The downward pointing triangle case is a case of amodal completion, and that's the same as here because you don't actually experience any boundaries of the arm behind player number 9. You just have a sense that that's where the whole arm is. So in some sense, in amodal completion, these parts of the object still seem present. Now, Robert Briscoe has argued that while some cases of amodal perceptual experience may involve the addition of mental imagery to perceptual experience, some do not. Briscoe says, some cases of occlusion will draw on your beliefs about various items you have encountered in the past and what they look like for completion to occur. They, he says, could involve imagery. And often, I'll note myself, these often seem like cases where you kind of have a choice what you can imagine. So if I show you this badly mocked up picture by myself, this is the extent of my computer skills and imagery going on here. So this is a cat whose tail is occluded behind an occluder. And I would suggest that to most people, this does not look like a cat whose tail has been cut off. It looks as if the tail continues behind the occluder. but exactly how it continues behind the occluder seems like, it's kind of open to interpretation, right? You could see it in one way, you could see it in the other way. Here's how it really is. I bet you probably weren't imagining that, but now you've seen it, and there you go. It now seems like it's kind of dripping back down in that somewhat unusual way. You probably didn't experience that because it's kind of unusual for cat's tails, I think, to do that. That's certainly for me, who's not a cat person, I would think of that as unusual. I was kind of seeing it as kind of straight up, maybe a little bending forward or something. Okay, you get the sense. Other cases are just not like this. So if you look at this image here doesn't complete as the octagons flankers on either side, despite the octagon flankers providing a context for thinking this does get complete, should be completed like this. Rather, people say that what they experience is this kind of figure here. So here we don't seem to have this voluntary element, like I can't make this look like an occluded octagon. It just looks like this to me. It just completes as this irregular figure. So what Robert Briscoe says is, in the second type of case, the amodal completed contours are unlike imagery because they're stimulus driven, they're stable in the absence of sustained effort and do not fade rapidly, they're not under volitional control, and they do not have visual or quasi-visual phenomenology. So I'm happy to grant 2 and 3, but my question would be, well, why shouldn't imagery have 2 and 3? Why is that not a possibility? For example, the imagery posited in flashbacks would be stable. It doesn't require sustained effort. In fact, people are trying to suppress it and they can't, and it often doesn't fade rapidly. That's what the problem is. On one, that it's stimulus driven, well, the occluded portions are determined by the surrounding context, but not by the occluded part of the image. So this case does seem differently determined by the stimulus than a standard perception. So when you see this, this area of the image is determined by this, your experience of this area of the image is determined by this area of the image. Your experience of this is really determined by the surrounding context. This seems quite like the following sort of case. If I say to you, visually imagine a cat, a lot of people have noted that you can't not visually imagine a cat when someone tells you to do it. In fact, if they tell you don't visually imagine a cat, it's even worse. So in this kind of case, it seems like the surrounding context is causing you to visually imagine a cat. So your imagery is stimulus driven, certainly not in the way that standard perception is. This kind of amodal case seems a bit like that to me. So it seems kind of, I would say, intermediate vis-a-vis whether it's stimulus driven or not. And what about his claim that amodal occlusion does not have visual or quasi-visual phenomenology? Well, Briscoe thinks that amodal completion does affect the phenomenology of our vision of the overall scene, mainly through the representation of unity of the occluded parts with the unoccluded parts, but he doesn't think the occluded portions are in our experience in a quasi-visual way. However, I think that amodal completion does have quasi-visual phenomenology of those occluded parts. It's just not the same as that of modal completion. So similar to the typical case of visual imagery, in amodal completion, you're clearly not experiencing the full contour or occluded part of the object as you would do where you're having a standard perceptual experience of where there's a lack of occlusion. Yet in some sense, you precisely are visually aware of the contour and the occluded part. So actually, I think this makes amodal visual completion really quite like visual imagery in that respect. And indeed, we can say more here. So one objection is that what I've said here is just wrong. Now, this objection has been made to me by Robert Briscoe and Derek Brown, sort of, in conversation. I don't believe it's in print. Anyway, this is their objection to me here. They say amodal completion doesn't have the same phenomenal character as typical visual imagery. Why is that? Well, if you look at this experience of occlusion that I've got on the screen here, I seem to add something extra to my experience if I visually imagine the occluded portions of the black lines being there. Okay. You're adding something in, so it's not imagery that's going on. That's their take on it. But my reply if I imagine that the black lines are not occluded, then clearly I'm adding something into my experience. But that would be to imagine something that's different to the experience that we're having when we're looking at the figure. The experience that you're having when you're looking at the figure is not that the black lines are occluded or unoccluded. You're experiencing them as occluded. So the real question is, if we visually imagine occluded black lines, where the black lines black, we then add something extra to our experience. And certainly if I consult my own experience, my experience says, no, if I look at this image and I imagine occluded black lines continuing on there, it just seems to me I ended up with the same experience and I don't add something to my experience. Thus, it's not clear to me at all that amodal perceptual experience is different to imagery experience at all. So another question is, do amodal completion experiences present their objects as existing? And I think that cases just split here. So if you see the cat behind the picket fence, then yeah, clearly it looks to you like there's a whole cat here and present, not present to be perceived, sort of unoccluded, but present nonetheless. In the Knizia figure, it seems to me that there might be occasions when you're fooled by this figure, when you think there really is a light, bright triangle there, occluding a downward facing triangle. But it certainly seems to me there are moments, certainly, where I realize that this is an illusion. And certainly when I think of that experience, when I see this picture and I realize that it's an illusion, then it seems to me like my experience doesn't present that there's really a downward facing triangle present. So this second type of amodal completion is therefore a bit more like visual imagery. The occluded parts of the object are somehow present in your experience, but they don't seem present in the world. In short, both forms of amodal completion, the kind that Briscoe thinks is more like the addition of imagery and the kind that he thinks is more like perception, just seem all to have features that are sort of halfway between perception and imagination. As in the case of derealized perception, I think there's good reason to hold that they shouldn't be classified as one or the other, right? Briscoe is saying, you know, the imagery case, that's imagery, but the amodal perception case, that's perception. And Nani is saying, no, no, both of these cases are imagery. And I just think, yeah, why don't, you know, how would you choose between those two views? I don't think we can. I think that's just arbitrary. And I think that we shouldn't worry about the criteria that really determine the nature of perception and imagination. These are just phenomena on a scale. So the very last issue that I want to talk about, I'm just checking my time here, yep. I'll just be a few minutes more. The final issue to mention concerning the sense of reality that's not frequently discussed to my knowledge arises in part from thinking about the case of occlusion, but only in part. It arises in various different ways. It seems to me that there are very different types of visual imagining that really rarely get mentioned. So here are the different types. Imagery of an apple being in the room that you are seeing, sitting on the table that you're seeing. So you're sort of placing an imagined object into your current environment that you're perceptually aware of. Contrast that case with this one. Imagery of an apple as being through the wall. So obviously you can't see into the next room, let's suppose, but you imagine the apple being on the desk, let's say you suppose is there. And all of this goes within your egocentric point of view, right? So you're from your point of view, you see the room, you sort of then imagine the room beyond it, and you imagine the apple beyond, you know, sitting within that. But this is all sort of taking place within your sort of egocentric frame of reference. Compare that kind of case to a case where you imagine an apple sitting in the next room, so you know where that room is relative to you, but from a position somewhere in that room, so not from your current egocentric visual point of view. And again, here's a different case, imagery of an apple, but there being no particular place that you imagine it to be. Perhaps you imagine it in some kind of mental space where there's just no relation between that mental space and the world. Quite often I end up, you know, imagine an apple. I don't know where that space is where I imagine the apple. It's not floating in front of my eyes. It's not behind my head. It's just, I don't know. I can just somehow imagine an apple in some sort of space. And then we can also do things like imagine an apple in a non-real place, like imagine an apple in fairyland. So there I'm imagining a whole imaginary world, or at least portions of it, or sort of take it to be that what I'm imagining is a place that doesn't exist, and then I can imagine an apple within that. All these cases, I think, vary in the sense of reality that our imagery experience has. And indeed, this is brought out by the fact that sometimes you can be surprised when what you visually imagine turns out not to be the case. So when you visually imagine your laptop is right there, you know, just behind you, and you turn around and it's not there, right? You're totally surprised. Where did it go? Did someone steal it? What happened? And likewise, the opposite can happen, right? So imagine you sort of have this fantasy that, you know, one day you'll walk into your bedroom and it's going to be stacked high with gold bars. And one day you walk into your bedroom and lo and behold, they're there. Like, you'd be totally surprised. And I think these kinds of reactions show us the different sense of reality that we can have through imagery. And in all these cases, what we see is a variation in the relation of the imagery to your current perceptual experience. So what this really shows us, again, is that imagery experiences vary along the dimension of sense of reality, and for many different reasons. So in summary, I think that visual perceptual experience and visual imagery are not categorically different, because first of all, there are many such states that exhibit some features of one and some of the other, and there are cases that are really hard to classify, and there's disagreement on how to do so. In light of that, we shouldn't arbitrarily categorize such cases, as I think people are doing, but because they're sort of somehow fixing on sort of one thing as being either necessary or sufficient, or trumping other considerations for the categorization of the state. But we should simply appreciate the non-categorical nature of the variety of cases that we find on this spectrum. And in talking about all this, I hope that I've helped to illuminate the phenomenal character of various imagery and perceptual experiences, and that might help people who don't have imagery to understand what it's like. I also hope that it helps scientific work in pulling apart these elements of imagery, and let's start asking people about their imagery along all these different sorts of definitions. And that's the end. Thank you very much.